Well, hello. Inside the Lexus ISF. Now, this particular model is a 2010. It has 65,000 miles, and it's been donated to us by a local viewer. I spent the last 3 or 4 days in this car, and it's the very first time I've ever been in a Lexus ISF. And because of that, I've been left with a couple pretty strong impressions. So, let's get into the positives first. Now, the big positive of this interior is its build quality, particularly when compared against some of its competitors. As I mentioned before, this car is about 10 years old and has 65,000 miles. It's also a track car, so it's lived not the most blessed life, and yet there are no squeaks and rattles. That's really the big positive of this interior. While it's not as aesthetically pleasing as an E92 or C63, the materials hold up a lot better. These seats look basically brand new. All the switchgear feels brand new. And it's a pretty simple interior. Unlike iDrive or the, let's call it the AMG infotainment system, it's very easy to use. While it looks dated, I know how to pair my phone. It took me about 2 seconds. The audio system in this car, while not amazing, is fairly simple to navigate. And lastly, the gauge cluster in this car too. It's stupid simple. At the end of the day, this is an affordable car, particularly now. They're between $20,000 to $30,000 for a 2010. There's only 2 drive mode switches, and it's very easy to turn off traction control. That's great. It's a regular IS on the inside, but because of that, it feels pretty dated. Mark always brings up how infotainment dates cars, and that's the case here. Because this car came out in the mid to late 2000s, it feels a lot older than it really is because of this screen. The other thing is, if you're a bigger buyer like myself, I'm 6 foot tall, and I struggle to get comfortable in this car. My head constantly touches the ceiling, and if you want to buy this as a track car, good luck fitting in here with a helmet. It's the unfortunate truth with the Lexus IS line as a whole. The other sad part about this car is legroom. It's great up front. I can get comfortable in the leg proportions. However, no one's fitting behind me. So this car becomes a 2-door, 4-door, meaning a 4-door with the practicality of a 2-door coupe. Thankfully though, as a daily driver, if you are shorter, you can fit all the Korean barbecue you could want in the trunk. It's great in that regards. If you're a shorter guy like Mark, who's 5'1", it's a very comfortable interior. He has none of the complaints I have. So keep that in mind when you're shopping for one of these. So with all that being said, we're already in the shop. Let's put this thing on the lift.
We are under the ISF, the Lexus, and this is a first of its kind, even though this is much older. So tell me a little bit about what happened here.
Well, this car is Genesis for Lexus. It's their first V8 rear-wheel drive M3 competitor. It was a car designed largely after hours by a very small team of engineers, and it was a passion project.
Yaguchi-san, the chief engineer of this car, who happens to be the chief engineer of the GSF, had his hand in the RCF. He was responsible for kind of creating what this brand meant. It had to be fun. It had to be engaging, an emotional connection, and it had to sound good, which is why they focus so much on the V8. People wonder, well, why didn't they do something else? Well, the V8 sounds amazing. And I think this was kind of the start. You can see how the RC, the LC, and the GS have kind of carried over a lot of what was good here and just expanded upon it.
Yeah, this car was a lot of firsts for Toyota. It had their very first 8-speed direct shift automatic. It's their first attempt of a real 5-liter V8, like a relatively high revving one at that.
Yeah.
It has a great architecture for the most part. It's double wishbone front, multi-link rear. It's an impressive car given how small the team of engineers was and their relatively small budget.
And you have to kind of turn your brain off for just a little bit with this and understand this was a mid kind of 2000s development project that kind of extended out, and this is not like an E92, an E90 competitor completely, because the body structure isn't nearly as good. They didn't have the development budget in terms of the chassis, so you don't see the weight distribution that you did on the E92. It's about 54 front. The cross balance isn't as good, which I'll show you the chart here. It weighs about, well, at least this one weighs about 3,770 pounds. So you don't feel the balance in the car that you would in some of the competitors at that time point. But the difference is They put so much money into the engine design, the transmission design. That's why this car feels special and why it's still relevant today.
Yeah, it's indestructible, and that's something that's going to come up a lot in this video. One of the reasons why the ISF has held its value even better than the E90 or C63 is when you buy this car, you don't have to stuff away $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 in case something, or actually not in case, when something catastrophic happens on your E90 or C63.
So if you're not stupid with this car and you don't go to try to modify it insanely or try to add a ton of horsepower, like this one, it's just going to last. And the owner tracks this car, and there's some things you're going to notice about it. This is prior to them using a ton of aluminum, so you still see a lot of stamped steel here. It does have an aluminum cradle for the subframe, but little details, like you still don't have adjustable camber on the front of this car, and that's something I complain about with the RCF. How do you make kind of a performance car that you can kind of take to the track and not have the ability to tune that? So you can't do it here either. And because of the way that they designed the suspension, they made the lower control arm bushings a little bit softer because the car is sprung more stiffly, the dampers are stiffer, so they have to kind of dial back the bushings to still give some slop there. And when you drive this hard, there's too much slop, and as those bushings age, it gets worse. So he's added solid mount bushings in the rear lower control arms at the bottom to kind of firm all of that back up when he's driving on the track. But these are just typical things that you're going to have to do on pretty much any car when you try to dual purpose them, and this is no different. But I think, let's head to the back, and then we'll talk about the transmission and then get under the hood. We've transported ourselves to the back half of the car, and this looks very similar to many modern Lexuses to a certain extent, except there's something special back here.
Yeah, it's got a limited slip diff. In 2010...
A Torsen.
Yes. In 2010 onwards to 14 till the end of the production line of this car, they had a Torsen limited slip. Earlier cars were open diff, which means honestly you should avoid those cars.
So from 2010 on is kind of the car that you want?
Yes.
Right.
In 2011, they did some suspension tweaks to get the car to handle a little better, to ride better, and they updated some of the interior electronics. But really, 2010 onwards is what you want to buy when you purchase this vehicle. Something we didn't bring up on the front that's worth mentioning is the brakes on this car are phenomenal. Lexus co-developed them with Brembo, and they're far superior, in my opinion at least, to the brakes you got on your E92. The
E92 brakes, the M3 brakes, I don't even know how they let that go out the door. They were absolute garbage. And you notice it right away. And granted, he's got track pads on this because he does take it out there. But even with that said, you feel a lot more confidence in stopping power, and repeated stopping doesn't turn into like just a sloppy rag. It doesn't feel like a wet rag when you get deep into the pedal like the E92 M3 did. It's great. I mean, it's genuinely impressive. And as we mentioned before, the rear cradle in this car is not aluminum like you get in the E92 M3. Yeah, and again, chassis development, right? This is when Lexus was trying to create, like they're trying to get into that, well, how do we make a performance car that's not just ES300s and all the things that they were known for, just kind of the quiet, comfortable, couch-like ride vehicles, and this was that turning point for them. They had to create something more fun to rejuvenate the brand. Yeah, they just worked with a compromised platform. This car was never designed, the IS was never designed in the first place to be an M3 competitor, so they worked with what they had. Yeah. The last thing to bring up back here, we'll touch on the trans when we get to the engine, are these exhausts. It comes up a lot. The dual tips are fake. Oh, go figure. Yeah, it's a cosmetic option. Really, it's a single tipped rear end exhaust with a fake, this whole fixture back here is not real. It looks cool to me. It's real tough. Well, that's nothing. This is what's happening in modern cars. It's no different. No. They just stacked it, make it look a little bit differently, but yeah, they're just finishers. We got to talk about the ISF specifically. This was Lexus's first attempt at creating an F car, and one of the big reasons and one of the big fundamentals behind it was the emotional connection over raw performance and spec sheets. It had to sound good. It had to feel good. And with the passage of time, there's some things that have stuck around, namely the engine. I think that's the biggest heart of this car, and namely as naturally aspirated V8s have disappeared. You just want to downshift, you want to floor it.
At the end of the day, I get that this is Genesis, but at the same time, it does show its age, Mark.
Well, how do you mean?
The trans. The trans is the big one for me. Yes, it's more reliable than the SMG, and it does shift better than the C63's automatic. But I have the same problem with all Toyota Transes. Below 5,000 RPM, it's totally dead.
Yeah, and I can kind of understand that. I mean, I get what they're trying to do here, and I've talked about this. I've beat a dead horse with this, with the RCF, GSF, and, you know, I know what they were getting at with the design. This was kind of the first iteration of that. It's definitely the worst, but the good things are still there. So the way that this transmission works is simple. You have to absolutely be flat out at the higher RPM to notice its ability to lock up the torque converter, to rev match, to shift quick up and down. If you're not at above 5,000 RPMs, this transmission feels like a 1995 Toyota Camry. It just is sloppy, it's slow, it's clunky, but that's what they wanted. They wanted it to be that car that when you're putting around, it feels smooth, there's no gear shocks. But I don't particularly think that adds up with what they're trying to do with the personality of the car. Specifically when you notice how rough this thing rides.
It's a weird car in that I feel like it's the middle ground between the C63 and the E92. And it's not quite as, let's call it, dynamic, pseudo-track car-y as the E92. So it's this weird in-between.
Well, the E92, and that's the issue with this car, is if you're going to compare it to the cars of that generation, specifically the E92 naturally aspirated V8, the S65, this just doesn't compare. And I mean, I think that's what you have to keep in mind is this car is what it was trying to compete with at the time. It just doesn't. But in retrospect, there's a couple things to talk about with that. While people are having problems with the S65 or the V10 version of it doing rod bearings and throttle actuators and all the expensive stuff that you had to do with those cars, this is still on the road. Very few people have transmission problems. They don't have engine problems, and that's why the resale value of this car is also insanely good. You can buy this and not have to set aside $6,000 to do just basic maintenance, and that's why I would purchase it over one of those cars.
I agree with you on that point, but you don't get the manual. The steering, while being direct, has literally no feedback. And the chassis, as you know, I like throwing cars sideways. The only way I feel this car pitching sideways is audibly and just the G-forces. I feel nothing in the suspension.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with this is, again, chassis tuning. The transmission wasn't the best. The engine is pretty great, but it didn't compare. But as of a car today, it feels very similar to like the RCF and GSF. It's just less power and it's just not as refined. But let's get this thing off the line and see how it does. I think this is plenty fast. I think it's faster than what you would expect it to be. And I think if somebody was purchasing this today for $25,000 and you got behind the wheel, you would be absolutely floored by how good this is from an engine perspective and the transmission perspective when you're revving it out.
Here's the problem. I know I'm down on this car. You have to get a 2010 because you have to get the limited slip. Right. But if you get a 2011 and above, the car becomes $30,000, $40,000, which it's way too much money for what you're getting.
Then you get an RCF at that point.
The car's too small to really be a four-door. I'm 6 foot tall. No one is getting behind me when I'm driving this car. It's really a two-door at that point, and I don't fit in it with a helmet. So I'm left with this car that isn't meant for me. While the engine is great, I love the way it sounds. The mechanical induction's amazing. I love how simple this car is. You just put it in manual mode, put it in sport, turn everything off and go. It's just, I don't quite love this car. It's 85% as good as the C63 and E92. It doesn't have the reliability problems, but I don't form anything emotional with this vehicle.
I think that's a great time to just get to the final thoughts. We can sum all of that up, talk about the pros and cons, and just move on with life. Final thoughts on the ISF. A huge thank you to Victor, who lent us his personal car to do this video. So many people have asked for it.
So let's get into it. Jack really had no connection to this. And one of his big issues was he didn't fit. He felt kind of trapped in this car, and it ruined the whole point of having a four-door sedan. Nobody could fit behind him. I fit perfectly. I had no issues with the seats, comfort. I could use it like a normal vehicle. So this is really important when we start talking about cars. It depends on who you are, your frame, your body type, whether a car is going to work or not. But outside of that, I've driven every single modern Lexus product, all the F products now, and I can appreciate the evolution of where these new cars were compared to the ISF. And the ISF is about 50-60% of like the RCF and GSF. The more modern 8-speeds in those newer cars are better programmed. They're more quicker to respond. They do a better job at being dual purpose, of being smooth on the street, and then when you drive flat out, they're quicker, way quicker than the ISF trans. But it's close. Most normal people aren't going to notice that. The engine, yes, it doesn't make as much power, but it feels every bit as good as the more modern cars. And the thing is, you're looking at buying this for probably a couple reasons. It doesn't have the insane over-the-top styling of the new Lexus products, and it's affordable, and you still get a V8, and it's reliable. That is why you would buy the ISF. And if you can find one in the low 20s, I'd say go for it. But if you start getting into that $35,000 price range for a newer one, I don't know. I would just spring the extra cash and go with the RCF or GSF. And I know the GSF is a lot more money, but the RCF can be had for about 40 grand in that price range. And I feel from a performance perspective, you're getting a lot more. You are losing some of the usability. But overall, I really enjoy driving this car. It's so well built, even to almost 10 years removed. Panel fitment, paint quality, interior build quality, everything works. That's why you get this car. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.